So can you please introduce yourself, starting with Andy?
Hey, I'm Andy. I work on React Native for Android.
Ok, ouais, ça fait déjà.
I'm Joe Savona. I work on Relay.
My name is Lee Byron. I work on GraphQL, React, and Immutable.js.
I'm Ben Alpert. I work on React.
I'm Nick Schrock. I work on GraphQL.
I'm Sebastian Mark Page. I work on React.
I'm Spencer Aarons. I work on React Native.
So anyone with a question? Yes, can an hostess get a mic, please? Or not?
So for GraphQL, it's been talked about in comparison to REST, but what do you think about in terms of prior art that's most well known, and how do you think it compares to things other than REST?
Can you, what prior art are you referring to exactly? Like OData and Sparkle and stuff? Or SOAP? What?
In terms of all of those, so our prevailing goal is simplicity for the developer experience. So we investigated a lot of these things when we started the project, looking for anything that did what it is that we wanted to do. And all of them either had extremely complicated APIs for server-side developers to tie these things in that just were completely incompatible with how we were working with data on our server, or they were just really, really difficult to learn for client developers. And a really easy experience for client-side developers was our primary priority, and nothing else that we found came anywhere close to what we had built on that front.
Yeah, to expand on that, I think there's a couple things. One, the unique thing about GraphQL is that we start with the client developer experience and then work backwards to technology. I don't think that is true of a lot of the other technologies that we're talking about. And the other thing is that these systems are often about timing and subtle aspects of taste, which are like qualitative issues. So, this kind of happens with products too. There are lots of products where things before are very similar, right? And then the kind of cliche, the next big thing is doing the last big thing right. And the marketplace had kind of spoken on those technologies. And most people had fled to REST and custom endpoints.
I'm not sure where the mic is. Anyone with a mic, can you speak up? Yeah, can you stand up?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Just do it live.
You just yell and we'll repeat the questions.
Yeah, we can hear you. Someone else have a
Okay,
question?
maybe you can hear me?
It's okay, it's okay.
Okay, we haven't heard about Immutable.js. What are the news about it? Is there some news, announcement, new developments, whatever?
Announcements? Not really. Yeah, I've been busy on GraphQL, so if you've been frustrated that the pace of development has slowed, you know why. I'm the sole developer of Immutable.js, so when I'm working on another thing, it slows down a bit. That being said, if persistent immutable data structures is something that you're passionate about and you want to help, I always take contributions from excited people, so there's news. Otherwise, development continues, so the project is far from done. There's a lot of work that we want to do. There are more data structures that are really interesting that could be added. There's ways of decoupling them, so if you only need one of the data structures, you don't have to pull in the whole library. And then just performance improvements in general. So there's a lot of work to be done on that front, just expanding and improving what we already have so far.
Someone, person with a mic? Someone has a mic? Oh, yeah.
Hi, I'm interested in React Context and what the future will be for the API of that, whether it's going to be deprecated. I know it's used in a lot of libraries.
So we just announced the beta for React 0.14, which has one change to it. It's the parent-based context. So this is something we created as a warning in 0.13, and it's now become a reality, so you can start using that. There's still issues with context. We haven't solved the updating of context, for example. So it's still an unstable API, but I'm pretty confident that we'll stick around in one form or another because the use case is clear. We've seen two different kinds of use cases. One is what I'm calling the wormhole use case, where you have a parent communicating with almost direct child, but not quite a direct child, and it wants to bypass some abstraction. The other one is the broadcast scenario, where you have a top-level thing like the current user or the current internationalization setting or the current routes being broadcast to everything in the page, basically, and everything updates accordingly. And those cases have different performance characteristics, so we might want to address them slightly differently, but so you need to be aware that the API will likely change in one form or another, but it will still be there.
Thanks for the great talk, guys. My question is about Jest. There's a feeling, I have a feeling, first of all, it seems very slow, but my question is, there's a feeling that from the last conference, this one, that we are not talking about tests a lot. There were no sessions about Jest or testing. What's the roadmap for Jest, and you're going to invest on that, and what do you recommend?
So Jest is a project that we use internally at Facebook for all of our JavaScript tests, and that includes for our React Native apps. And so it works well for us. For a while, we didn't have anybody actively working on it. Now, I believe we have one person who's spending most of his time working on Jest again. Just earlier this week, some big performance improvements landed where it'll cache the transformed JavaScript of your source files so that it doesn't need to regenerate that every time you run it. And so we're going to continue making it better. And we're obviously big believers in testing, and also working on trying to make testing easier from the React front. We've in the last release, or maybe the release before that, we introduced a new test utility for what we call shallow rendering, which is basically just rendering to see what one component's render function returns without actually rendering all of that component's children. And so it's basically a helper to help you instantiate that component and then call render on it. And that's another tool that you can use. So we still use Jest, but we don't want to make it tied to anything else in the stack. So if another testing tool works better for you, then feel free to use that.
I've heard a few people talk about how components are like pure functions, but it's not exactly true because it's really just the render method that's pure. And I'm wondering, have you guys considered actually making the entire class, the entire component a pure function or an immutable object?
Yeah, so one of the features that we have planned for 0.14, it didn't actually make it into the beta, but we do plan to support it, I think, in the final release, assuming we can get the pull request merged, is a feature where you can actually define for components that are fully pure. You can define them as just a function, so basically just the render function. It'll take props as an argument and then just return what you want from render. And so that will make it easier to define these pure components, and and then we'll also be able to, from the React side, make optimizations based on this and keep less bookkeeping, because we won't need to instantiate any of our internal bookkeeping to keep track of the components. So that should also be faster, and then we'll start encouraging people to build their components around that more and more. I think to some degree you need state in components, because UIs are stateful. When you click on a drop down, it opens, and that's like a change, and the state needs to live somewhere. It can live. Some people want to put it in a Flux store. If you don't have really complicated needs, it's probably best to just put it in that component state. But for components that aren't stateless, and especially components that might just wrap one other component without changing it too much. If you have a button component, then you can create a fancy button component, and that usually won't need state of its own. And so we're going to make that easier in the next release.
I think that in the future we will probably embrace that kind of pure style, but there's different ways of updating state, and currently state is a side effect. Even in something like OM or in ClojureScript, you sort of have side effects that trigger the state update. And we're looking to different ways of doing that. So the first change came in 0.13, where you can pass the function into state to clarify that this execution is not immediate, it's something that might happen later. And we're exploring different ways of expressing that syntax that may or may not use classes. But I don't think that React will necessarily end up being just a single function. It will not be a sequence of executing functions. For example, in Relay, you have the notion of a query executing. You might have the separate function that expresses the initial state of a local component. So there might be a group of functions that needs to be used to express a single component.
Hey. Yeah? Can you hear me? Okay. My question is about this size and performance of React.js library, which can be sometimes unfriendly to old devices, old mobile devices. And have you heard of Virtual DOM benchmark? And if yes, what's your thoughts on it, and why the numbers are so low compared to others?
So there's different kinds of benchmarks. It came up on Twitter today as well. There's been different sort of trade-offs you have to do depending on what kind of implementation you do. And we focus a lot on making sure that the overhead of abstractions is really low. And if you build something like a virtual DOM library, you have no way of building abstractions. So obviously, it's going to take zero cost, but you also can't build abstractions. Then there's other performance implications. I think I talked about that in my talk yesterday, that you can try to solve the longest common subsequence problem, which means that moves becomes much more efficient than, for example, insertions and deletions. But what we see in large our apps is that we don't have large flat lists because we use windowing to our benefit, for example. We don't see a lot of random moves of items. We see a lot more insertions and deletions of items. And our primary use case to optimize is actually insertion of a very large new view. For example, an initial page load or switching between tabs or loading a new interface. And we're not seeing a lot of those benchmarks. But then there's also a lot of overhead inside of React, especially as we do a lot of refactoring, creating these deprecation APIs, and a lot of the work we've been doing for the last year or so have led to some regressions. But we've reached a point now where we've cut off a lot of the branches that we wanted to do and a lot of the deprecations that we wanted to do to allow performance optimization in the future. And we have a large push at Facebook now to make a lot of these optimizations that we haven't done inside of the DOM rendering specifically. And if you look at something like React Native, the optimization we've done for that is better than what we've done for the DOM. But we're shifting back to the DOM to do more optimizations there. The problem we have is that we don't have really good benchmarks of use cases. And we're working on developing them for us. But if you have real-world use cases where you've ported a real-world scenario that you find problematic and where React is slow, then we would like to see that. A lot of the articles we have in comparisons of the benchmarks now are not real-world, and they're not what we expect to be common scenarios. But if you feel differently, then I definitely want to know.
So my question is about GraphQL and endpoints. I was having a conversation earlier around the need to support, for some reason, a legacy REST set of endpoints. And if you were really enthusiastic about building a GraphQL API, but you needed to expose some REST API endpoints as well, do you think it's a crazy idea to implement the GraphQL API and then have the REST API just like a thin wrapper that actually uses the GraphQL API to do its thing?
I think are you saying using REST to wrap GraphQL or the other way around?
If you had a GraphQL API as your sort of first implementation, but you needed to expose some REST endpoints, it seems like you could build your REST endpoints by internally using GraphQL to fetch your data.
Yeah, that's totally feasible. Effectively, I think there's a couple ways you could, if you need to support legacy REST endpoints, you can effectively just hard code a GraphQL query in the REST endpoint and then return the shape of the JSON that's expected. There's also possibilities to wrap it the other way, but I think we'll explore those as people migrate back and forth, or as you have to support REST endpoints or maybe external clients that do you want to add?
Yeah, I would add to that if you already have a REST API, maybe it's not the best decision to start with trying to tear that thing apart. Just like let your apps keep working, keep your REST API. You can just expose a new endpoint for GraphQL and experiment with that first. And then maybe down the line, if all your apps are using GraphQL, except for some 2-year-old apps that are using the REST endpoint and you just like hate maintaining that thing, then yeah, awesome. Expose a GraphQL hard-coded query as your REST endpoint and be done with it. That's totally fine.
Is there someone with a mic out there? Yep.
What's on the roadmap for 1.0?
Of what?
1.0.
React, sorry.
Oh, sorry. There's a lot of things that could go 1.0.
Well, to be honest, we're not really sure what 1.0 means for React. We're really embracing the idea that we want to make sure that everyone is always on the latest version, and we want to make it easy to upgrade all the time. And we realize that upgrading your code base is a real cost to companies and a real cost to your time, and can be annoying. So we take that very seriously. We don't want to release too frequently. As you see, there was how many months ago, like 5 months ago, that we released the last beta. And we take the upgrade path really seriously. So we want to make sure that we have simple deprecation notices. We do all these upgrades ourselves internally at Facebook before we make the release, so we know that it's possible. And it's a huge cost to us as well. So it depends on what it means to be 1.0. We might even just skip 1.0 to have an extra dot in our semantic versioning to play with the semantic versioning. But generally, I think we're rapidly approaching 1.0. If you look at like React Future, what we've been iterating on is sort of the first sequence of those folders. And what we've been working on is deprecating things that doesn't allow us to change the internals and how they work. And I think that will sort of what can be seen as 1.0. And then the question becomes, what is 2.0? And how do you upgrade to 2.0? Well, we're not really sure yet, but we want to make sure that we're not making a huge rapid shift, because that's not going to be sustainable for us. So we want to make sure that we can progress slowly towards whatever that model is. It might not be a very comforting answer, but I try to make it easy.
Is there someone with a mic? Is there someone with a mic? Yeah, go. And please raise your hand if you want to talk so that you can get a mic. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello. Is this on? Yeah, okay. So I guess JavaScript's always been quite dynamic in the browser, and you often get the data you weren't expecting. And at the moment, if you sort of pass the wrong thing to React, it kind of just blows up, and then you can never recover from rendering. Like, do you think React should improve that error handling story, or is that like a user space problem?
Yeah, so this is something we're working on. We call it this error boundaries, and so we do plan to implement some kind of way to catch and handle errors. we're still not going to advocate using exceptions for control flow because there's a real cost to adding try catches to all the rendering paths. But for catching errors and gracefully showing an error to the user that just says, sorry, something went wrong, please reload or file a bug report, that is definitely something we want to support. If you saw Dan Abramov's talk yesterday in React Hot Loader, he had this cool little red box that shows up if your components throw an error, and it will probably look something like that, and it'll be configurable so that you can show whatever message that you want. But yeah, we realize this is a real problem, and especially more so if you have a giant single React tree instead of a spattering of React components on your page.
I can just make a plug for immutable data structures in general. Is one of the things that makes this difficult is because we use mutation to optimize inside of React. If React itself was implemented using immutable data structures, which is something we're exploring and see what the performance characteristics are in modern engines, then it would be much easier to implement that than it is now. And that's just an indication that we're all on the right track by moving more towards immutability, even inside React core.
Hi. So, does it work? Hello? Okay, so Netflix is working on Falcor, which is trying to solve similar problems to GraphQL and Relay, and I guess you have some knowledge about how it works and how it looks. So could you talk a bit about the differences in the approach and in what use cases would your be better? And
yeah, I'll answer the first part, and then I'm sure Relay has an opinion. So we've met with the Netflix folks a couple of times, and my initial impression is just excitement, because we both have found that this is a big problem and we're chasing it together. So just to kind of repeat back an earlier question that was asked of prior art. So the fact that Netflix is also investigating ways to solve this problem means that they also arrived at the fact that prior art doesn't solve the problems in the way that we want to solve them. So they have similar goals in that they have clients, and the clients want to describe the data that they need, and then they want a reasonably invisible way of getting that data in an efficient way. The major difference from GraphQL's point of view, and I'll let Joe talk about the Relay point of view, is the mechanism by which you do that. So Falcor doesn't have one described query, but instead distributes that query in terms of observables throughout the entire code base. So it kind of looks a little bit more like getter functions if every getter function was like a observable, a promise that could return many things. Whereas GraphQL is declarative, and you write them in pieces that mirror the resulting objects that get back. That doesn't mean that GraphQL can't be streamy or asynchronous in the future, but that was the primary piece of abstraction that Netflix wanted to build on top, which shaped how Falcor came together.
Yeah, so, can you hear me? Maybe use this mic.
Yeah, if only there was a working mic. Okay, yeah, so I mean, kind of Lee covered this pretty well. The main difference is really about kind of the developer experience that you want. Netflix started from observables, and the entire system is kind of built around that. Relay was more designed from, let's fetch all the information we want up front, and then we'll allow optionally deferring information until later. And so I think that's pretty much the key differentiator. A lot of the stack, JSON Graph is roughly analogous to GraphQL. A lot of things that they have in their system for caching information locally, only fetching information that's missing, things like that. It's again very, very similar systems. And so really the main difference is around Relay focuses on a declarative API. There's things that you simply can't do with observables, right? If I run an observable and then I say on next, that's the thing that happens inside there is completely invisible to the framework. You can't look ahead and say, oh, we need some information about the story, and then down here we need more information about the story, because that's in an observable, it's in a callback, and we just don't know that we're going to need that. So the observable-based design kind of prohibits certain types of optimizations. You might be able to work around that, but yeah.
One of those optimizations that's critically important for the use cases that we have is minimizing round trips. So Netflix's primary use case is making your TV go fast, where you're streaming HD video, and they do not care that they have to do multiple round trips to do this, because if you can't do multiple round trips in a short amount of time, you also can't stream HD video. For Facebook, we want to support mobile devices that are going to show up on crappy connections all over the world. So we care way more about being able to do things in as few round trips as possible, and we've built crazy stuff at Facebook on top of GraphQL to push that to an extreme. So the primitives that we use shape that result dramatically.
And I could just mention the developer experience from the React point of view. When you're building a component, you have two defaults. So we're talking about our default is we fetch everything ahead of time, and you can optionally defer things. Or you can have the default being that you stream continuously in everything. But if you can stream in everything, you have to think about the developer experience designing the temporal state where something is not currently loaded. And if that's the default, there's a lot more of those states that you have to think about.
Hi.
Can you stand up? Can you stand up?
Hi. My question is about GraphQL. Being that it's so flexible that the client can basically ask for, any information that's been said that the system is capable of delivering, what's to stop the client from making a very malicious request that could basically end up DOSing the system? Like if you have a graph of very interconnected entities, you could potentially create a query that would, end up asking for a lot of the same information. Like which measurements have you taken to ensure that this can't happen?
So there's a couple aspects here. So I think the pernicious case that you're talking about is like, for instance, Facebook land, you could ask for like friends of friends of friends, which is potentially about 3 billion people. So we obviously couldn't service that request. So for a true really malicious client that doesn't know what they're doing, or is having fun, it's difficult to control. For more kind of casual mistakes, I think GraphQL is actually very effective. Because this whole notion of expressing capabilities and then the client opts into it, I think the classic example is like order by. Server developers have to explicitly opt into, yes, I am willing to support this order by because I thought about indexing and yada, yada, yada. We don't support passing up arbitrary strings for order by to order by arbitrary data. So it's kind of a mixed bag. Within Facebook, to handle the pernicious query or malicious query case, we actually kind of have monitoring tools that sample production data and kind of can catch that earlier. But I think this is one of the areas we're going to explore as we roll out the system. Because you can imagine embedding metadata in the type system to catch this earlier in the process.
Another thing is GraphQL queries don't just kind of slowly range in performance until they get too slow. You have a classic n versus n squared versus n cubed problem, right? So if you just fetch a list of friends, that might execute reasonably fast. If you ask for friends of friends, that might be really, really slow because n and n squared are hugely different. So if you're worried about someone on your team who just maybe isn't thinking that much about server-side efficiency, they probably are thinking about client-side efficiency, and they're going to be curious why they changed the query, and now instead of running in 1 second, it's running in 25 seconds. And so they probably won't do that. The malicious case is what you have to be worried about, and there are just so many other aspects that you have to be careful about, and having proper monitoring is just the right first defense for any kind of malicious client.
And to be fair, we have no server-side infrastructure devs here who have to keep all the product engineers in check. They may have a slightly different perspective on this problem.
Is there a mic about there? No? Oh, here, sorry.
I just wanted to ask about some of the old ideas that have been around for a while. So there's been sideways data loading, so there's been a lot of discussion about that. And there was this old idea of rendering from web workers. So can you give us an update of what's happening on those two, if it's a bad idea, if you're doing anything about it?
So I think that sideways data loading is definitely something that we need to have. There's two schools of thought. Some people think that we should not have that in React itself and everything should be exposed.
Can you explain what that is for people who don't know what sideways data loading means?
Oh, yeah. It's basically the scenario where, I think I mentioned the case yesterday with, what if we implement an image tag where the source is a URL, but you don't have the data coming from your props. So you have to have something in the component that defines where that data is coming from, if it's not coming from above. And you want to be able to create that as an abstraction of the components. And to do that, we have a few different proposals. One is the data read tracker, which is more of a side effectful tracking that tracks what data you're reading from and automatically wires up subscriptions. The other one is automatically a declarative model for the subscribing to observables and promises or some other declarative model for subscriptions. And then another proposal is just leave it out of React altogether. I don't think that leaving it out of React altogether is very useful because it doesn't allow us to do a lot of the declarative optimizations that we could enable in the future by having this declarative API. And by building it into React, we can say that let's batch all these things together, let's do things across components, let's defer depending on performance characteristics and what CPU time we have left in an animation frame, for example. And this is related to the second part of the question, which is the workers, what's happening to the worker model. Basically, there's a few ways of implementing workers. The early example was, let's just move all of React to the worker and then do the diffing and then send the data to the DOM. The problem is that a lot of the DOM APIs expect to be synchronous to be able to interop. So we have to have an ability to do that on the main thread to be able to integrate with existing systems. Prevent default of events is one example. One of those ways we could still do workers is by rendering React on two sides. One on the worker side, and then everything on the worker is lower priority than everything on the main thread, but we still have the ability to execute code on the main thread as well and build abstractions that are asynchronous on top of the synchronous abstractions that we have today. But the problem with that model is that there's serialization costs between these two workers, and there's also startup costs creating these both these environments. And it also doesn't allow a lot of flexibility of shifting priorities. You can only set up 2 different priorities. So we're exploring other ways of doing time slicing and priority of execution that could potentially work in a single worker or in parallel or even on the GPU. So it's undefined at the moment.
Cool. So we have 2 questions left, and then we're going to go. So first one here, and then here. Yep.
Hello. Regarding the upgrade path that you mentioned earlier, I've been thinking for a while about someone should write some kind of transpiler to help people to upgrade. Actually, I think we should be able to do things a little bit more automatically than having to manually go through all the steps. And someone told me that you have some kind of script that you use at Facebook to help people to upgrade their code when you switch React versions. Is that true? And is it something you've considered open sourcing or giving people more assistance in upgrading, basically?
Yeah. So most of the breaking changes that we do are either things like simple renames where it's easy to just grep your code and do them that way, where an automated script would take longer for us to write than would really provide a benefit. And then a lot of the time also we make changes where it's just completely impossible to grep your code, and for those we always do warnings for at least a release so that you can hopefully notice all the call sites. And hopefully, we had a big one of these when we introduced the React element type, if you were there like a year ago. But hopefully we won't have too many more of those. But we do have a couple automated scripts, as you mentioned. And so one of these is for the get DOM node deprecation. If you saw the blog post, we're replacing it with react DOM.find DOM node, actually. We're splitting it into 2 packages. Check out the blog post if you didn't see it. But changing it from a method to a function, and that's still not terrible to do by hand if you are grepping your code, but we have a tool that we developed at Facebook. One of our engineers, Felix, developed this tool called JS Code Shift, which basically takes a JavaScript file, parses it into an AST, and then you can write whatever transformations you want on it, and then it'll write it back to a JavaScript file. It's pretty similar to just any Babel transformation, actually. And we have two transforms for React that were written in this. They're actually, they are both open source in a package called React Code Mod. I think we haven't done a great job publicizing it, but I mentioned it briefly in the 14 beta blog post, and we'll talk about it more if there are more transforms. But the two that are there are the get DOM node to find DOM node transform, and then also an experimental transform for converting React.create class to ES6 classes. And that one's a little bit conservative, and it bails out if it isn't sure that it can do a safe transformation. But those are both available, so it's a package called React Code Mod on NPM.
And I can also explain just how we do the upgrades at scale at Facebook, because some of you are coming from really large code bases and you might be interested. So we don't actually just wait for everyone to see the warning messages. What we do is that we log. So everyone using and developing the products at Facebook, if they get a warning, we override that module and we log the warning to a server, and then we as the team are monitoring these warnings. Sometimes we fix them ourselves, sometimes we assign tasks to people to fix them, but we make sure that they keep going down so that we are comfortable that we're going to be able to upgrade. So we just don't blindly rely on people seeing the warnings.
I have a question about React Native for Android. We have a lot of details about the React Native for iOS, but we haven't really heard much about the tech stack, like what is actually running in the JavaScript and how does that work compared to iOS?
So it's pretty similar to what happens on iOS. On iOS, they actually ship with the same executor that we're shipping Ads Manager with. So the architecture is basically the same. The interface is the same, basically. Do you have any specific questions?
iOS, you're running on iOS. You're running JS core or whatever it's called. But what is actually executing the JavaScript on Android? Is it a web view or what is?
It's also JavaScript core.
Oh, okay.
Cool. Well, this is the end of ReactEurope. Like, thanks a lot, everyone, for coming. And I know I had a blast, and I hope you had. And I hope that you're going to, like, go back to like your respective lives and everything, but please like try to build a community and try to like not trash talk on project and try to like do experiments and things like this. So thank you very much and have a good day.